3 times. Not once, not as a footnote buried in a policy reversal nobody noticed, but 3 separate publicly documented retreats over the course of a single year and a half, each one following the exact same pattern. Donald Trump reaches for a tariff on Canadian potash. American farm groups sound the alarm within days, and the White House backs down. It happened in March 2025. It happened again weeks later when the tariff dropped all the way to 0. And it happened a 3rd time in the summer of 2026 when potash was written into a formal exemption inside one of the most aggressive tariff proclamations of this entire trade war. If you want to understand where the real structural power actually sits in the relationship between the United States and Canada, forget the headlines about autos and dairy and hockey sticks for a moment, because none of those tell you as much as this one. Quiet, unglamorous fertilizer input does. Potash is the commodity Washington keeps threatening and keeps unthreatening over and over, because touching it seriously would mean doing real, immediate damage to one of the most politically protected groups in all of American life, the American farmer. Stick with this video because we are going to walk through all 3 retreats in detail, why each one happened, and what this pattern tells you about the actual limits of American leverage in this entire 18-month trade conflict. If breakdowns like this are useful to you, hit subscribe now because this is one of the clearest examples of real economic leverage actually working that this entire trade war has produced. Let's start with what potash actually is and why it carries this much weight, because the scale of American dependence here is genuinely extreme, more extreme than almost any other single input in modern American agriculture. And understanding that scale is essential to understanding everything that follows. Potash is a potassium-based mineral, one of the 3 essential nutrients, alongside nitrogen and phosphorus, that every major American crop needs to grow at commercial scale. Corn, wheat, and soybeans, the backbone of American agricultural exports, all depend on regular potash application to maintain the yields American farmers have built their entire operating model around. The United States imports the overwhelming majority of the potash it uses, and Canada, specifically the province of Saskatchewan, supplies close to 90% of the total. Saskatchewan sits on top of the largest known recoverable potash reserves anywhere on the planet, more than 1 billion tons, dwarfing what Russia or Belarus, the next largest producers, can offer. Building a new potash mine from scratch, starting with exploration and ending with first commercial production, takes somewhere between 10 and 15 years. The United States has only limited domestic potash production, concentrated in New Mexico and Utah, nowhere near enough to meaningfully offset a serious disruption to the Canadian supply. That combination, near total import dependence, an overwhelming reliance on a single supplying country, and effectively no ability to build alternative domestic capacity on any timeline shorter than a decade, is what makes potash such a uniquely dangerous commodity for any American administration to tariff aggressively, no matter how much broader leverage it believes it holds over Canada and every other part of this complex, deeply interconnected trade relationship. The first retreat happened almost immediately after this broader trade war began, and it happened fast enough that it barely registered as its own story at the time, buried inside a larger announcement about tariff exemptions, more generally covering both Canada and Mexico simultaneously. Trump's original tariffs on Canada and Mexico launched in early February 2025, a sweeping 25% duty applied broadly across both countries. Within days, agricultural groups began sounding alarms about what a blanket tariff on potash specifically would do to farm input costs heading into planting season, historically one of the most cost-sensitive stretches of the entire agricultural calendar. On March 6, 2025, just 2 days after formally launching this continental trade war, the White House issued a new executive order carving out specific exemptions, and potash was treated as its own distinct category within that carve-out. Rather than the full 25% rate applied to most other Canadian goods, potash was set at 10%, deliberately aligned with the lower rate Washington was applying to Canadian energy products. Another category the administration recognized it could not afford to disrupt without immediate, visible domestic consequences. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins put out a statement praising the move in terms that, read carefully, reveal exactly how much pressure had been building behind the scenes in just those first few days. She called the potash reduction a critical step in helping farmers manage and secure key input costs at the height of planting season, language that acknowledges directly how urgent and immediate the concern had become inside farm country. The American Farm Bureau Federation, one of the most politically influential agricultural lobbying organizations in the country, put out its own statement through President Zippy Duvall, thanking the administration specifically for the pause and noting that Farm Bureau had been engaging directly with the White House, the Department of Agriculture, and the Office of the United States Trade Representative throughout those first frantic days of the trade war. That kind of rapid, coordinated lobbying push, producing a formal policy reversal within roughly 72 hours of the original tariff taking effect, is not the normal pace at which trade policy typically moves. It reflects genuine, immediate alarm inside one of the most powerful agricultural lobbies in Washington, and an administration that recognized it needed to respond to that alarm quickly, rather than let it fester through an entire planting season. It is worth understanding exactly why potash carries this specific structural weight compared to almost any other agricultural input, because the answer is not simply that it is important, but that it is genuinely, mechanically irreplaceable within any time frame that matters to a farmer planning next season's crop. Nitrogen fertilizer can, in a pinch, be manufactured domestically using natural gas as a feedstock, and the United States has substantial natural gas production capacity to draw on if it needed to scale up nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing quickly. Phosphorus has meaningful domestic production in states like Florida and North Carolina, giving American agriculture at least a partial buffer against disruption in that specific nutrient. Potash has no such buffer. The geology simply is not there in sufficient concentration anywhere else in North America outside Saskatchewan, and the handful of smaller domestic operations in New Mexico and Utah were never built at anything close to the scale needed to substitute for the volume Canada currently supplies. That asymmetry between the three essential crop nutrients, two with at least some domestic flexibility and one with almost none, is precisely why potash has repeatedly triggered a faster, more consistent political retreat than tariffs on nitrogen or phosphorus-related products ever have throughout this same broader trade conflict. There's also a pricing dynamic worth understanding here, because potash markets do not behave the way a casual observer might expect a globally traded commodity to behave under a straightforward supply and demand model. Global potash demand has been on a fairly steady upward trajectory, with industry forecasts from major producers projecting worldwide consumption climbing toward the mid-70s of millions of tons annually in the near term, driven substantially by rising demand from major agricultural economies like China, which continues importing meaningful volumes even alongside its own significant domestic production. At the same time, new supply has been entering the market from expanding operations both inside Canada and from newer international producers, meaning the long-term pricing picture for potash is considerably more complicated than a simple story of runaway scarcity. But that longer-term global supply and demand balance is almost entirely irrelevant to the specific, short-term vulnerability American agriculture faces from a targeted tariff on the Canadian supply route specifically. A tariff does not care whether global potash production capacity is expanding over a 10-year horizon. It raises the immediate delivered cost of the specific tonnage crossing the specific border that 90% of American farmers currently depend on. And that immediate cost increase is what has triggered every one of these three retreats, regardless of what the broader global commodity picture looks like in any given year. The second retreat came almost as quickly as the first, and it is the one most people watching this trade war never fully registered, because it happened through a technical legal reclassification rather than a dramatic new announcement. According to detailed reporting on how this specific tariff evolved, not long after that initial reduction to 10%, the administration determined that potash imports actually qualified for coverage under the existing North American trade agreement and dropped the tariff again, this time all the way to zero. Journalists covering the fertilizer sector at the time described the move as revealing, in their words, how sensitive this topic is, given that farmers represent one of Trump's core political constituencies, and how genuinely difficult it is to impose meaningful tariffs on a commodity this deeply embedded in the cost structure of American food production. Two retreats within the span of a few weeks, each one moving in the same direction, each one triggered by the same underlying recognition that potash simply could not be treated the same way as other Canadian imports without generating real, fast-moving political blowback from farm states. There is a particularly telling detail buried inside how that second retreat actually got explained publicly at the time, because it reveals something about how administrations sometimes prefer to frame a retreat as a technical legal necessity rather than as a direct response to political pressure. Describing the move as potash simply qualifying for existing trade agreement coverage, rather than describing it as a deliberate concession to farm lobby pressure, allowed the administration to walk the tariff back to zero without having to explicitly acknowledge that the earlier 10% rate had already proven politically unsustainable within just a few weeks. That kind of framing, wrapping a substantive retreat inside technical, legalistic language, is a common pattern in how administrations of both parties tend to manage policy reversals without appearing to have simply caved to lobbying pressure. And it is worth recognizing here specifically because it means the true pace and scale of these retreats was likely somewhat obscured from casual observers, even as it was happening in real time. The third retreat is the one that reveals the most about how permanent this pattern has actually become, because it happened well over a year later, in a completely different phase of this trade conflict, under a completely different legal authority, and the administration still arrived at the exact same conclusion. By December 2025, tensions around potash flared up again, this time in an unusual and, for many observers, genuinely uncomfortable context. That same month, the Trump administration struck a deal with Belarus, one of Europe's most entrenched authoritarian governments, securing the release of 123 political prisoners in exchange for lifting certain sanctions that had been restricting Belarusian potash exports. Belarus is one of the only other major potash producers in the world, besides Canada and Russia, and easing its access to international fertilizer markets was widely read by trade analysts as Washington quietly building an alternative supply route, specifically so it would have more leverage to threaten Canadian potash, again without triggering an immediate domestic fertilizer shortage. Commentators covering the fertilizer sector at the time pointed out the strange contradiction sitting at the heart of that decision, that the United States was actively easing the path for Belarusian potash to reach global markets while simultaneously threatening to tax Canadian potash in a way that would directly hurt American farmers, raising a genuinely pointed question about whether a strategy that penalizes your most reliable long-term supplier in favor of leverage against a geopolitically hostile one could really be called America First in any coherent sense. It is worth spending a little more time on the Belarus angle specifically, because it represents one of the more genuinely unusual pieces of statecraft to emerge from this entire 18-month trade conflict, and it directly connects to why the third potash retreat carries even more weight than the first two. Belarus, led by Alexander Lukashenko, has been treated as one of the most isolated, sanctioned governments in Europe for years, largely due to its close alignment with Russia and its record on human rights and political repression. Securing the release of 123 political prisoners in exchange for sanctions relief was, on its own terms, a genuinely significant humanitarian achievement, one that drew measured praise even from voices generally skeptical of this administration's broader approach to foreign policy. But the specific mechanism of that sanctions relief, easing restrictions that had been limiting Belarusian potash exports to international markets, reveals something important about how seriously Washington was taking the structural vulnerability tied to Canadian potash dependence, even a full year after the first two retreats. If American negotiators genuinely believed they held unlimited leverage to simply tariff Canadian potash whenever convenient, there would have been little strategic reason to simultaneously work to build out an alternative supply route through a government as diplomatically fraught as Belarus. The fact that this alternative supply maneuver happened at all suggests the administration itself recognized, internally, that its ability to pressure Canada on this specific commodity remained genuinely constrained. Constrained enough that diversifying away from total Canadian dependence looked strategically worthwhile, even at the cost of doing business with one of Europe's most isolated regimes. The Belarus maneuver also deserves scrutiny on its own economic merits, because the math behind it never actually worked in Washington's favor in the way the initial framing might have suggested. Belarus and Russia together, even combined, supply only a modest fraction of what Canada alone ships to the United States every year. And neither country has anywhere near the production infrastructure needed to scale up quickly enough to meaningfully offset a serious disruption to Canadian volumes. Industry analysts covering the fertilizer sector at the time were blunt about this reality, noting that Belarusian potash production capacity could not fill anywhere close to 15% of what Canada currently ships annually to American farmers, meaning the entire alternative supply strategy amounted to a partial hedge at best, not a genuine substitute for the underlying Canadian dependence. That gap between the strategic intention behind the Belarus deal and its actual practical capacity to solve the underlying vulnerability is part of why, despite that maneuver, the administration still felt compelled to write potash into the formal exemption list just 7 months later when the Section 338 proclamations were finally signed in July 2026. Despite that Belarus maneuver, when the administration finally moved forward with its most aggressive tariff action yet against Canada, the three Section 338 proclamations signed on July 20th, 2026, invoking a law that had not been used to impose tariffs in 96 years, potash was again explicitly written into the list of exemptions. The White House's own fact sheet justifying those tariffs states plainly that the Section 338 duties would not apply to energy, potash, products already covered under separate Section 232 tariffs, or certain other goods like fish and critical minerals. Read that list again, because it tells you something the administration has now confirmed in writing, in an official government document, on 3 separate occasions across 18 months. Potash sits in the same protected category as energy and critical minerals. The handful of Canadian exports Washington has repeatedly concluded it simply cannot afford to disrupt, regardless of how aggressive it is willing to be everywhere else in this relationship. There is also a useful comparison to draw between how potash has been treated throughout this conflict and how the other major exempted categories, energy and critical minerals, have followed a broadly similar pattern. because together these three exemptions form a coherent picture of where genuine Canadian leverage actually concentrates inside this relationship. Canadian crude oil feeds American Midwest refineries that were specifically engineered decades ago to process that exact grade of heavy crude, infrastructure that cannot simply pivot to a different supplier without years of costly retrofitting. Canadian critical minerals, including uranium and niobium, sit at the center of America's own strategy to reduce dependence on Chinese mineral supply chains, meaning tariffing them would directly undermine a separate, higher priority national security objective the administration has pursued aggressively elsewhere. Potash joins that same category for reasons specific to agriculture rather than energy or defense, but the underlying logic is identical in each case. Wherever American economic infrastructure has become deeply structurally dependent on a specific Canadian input with no readily available substitute, Washington has consistently, repeatedly chosen exemption over confrontation, regardless of how aggressive its posture has been everywhere else in this same conflict. That consistency across three genuinely different categories, energy, minerals, and agriculture, suggests this is not a series of isolated, commodity-specific decisions, but a broader recognition running through the administration's overall trade strategy that certain forms of economic interdependence simply cannot be weaponized without inflicting unacceptable self-harm, no matter how much political appetite exists for confrontation elsewhere. It is also worth noting how differently this pattern has played out compared to categories where the administration has shown genuine willingness to sustain pressure despite real domestic costs. Autos have remained tariffed at meaningful rates throughout nearly this entire conflict, even though the auto industry involves deeply integrated cross-border supply chains that raise costs for American manufacturers just as directly as a potash tariff would raise costs for American farmers. Dairy tariffs have persisted despite similar warnings from American food processors about rising input costs. That contrast matters because it demonstrates the potash exemption is not simply a general administration preference for avoiding any tariff with domestic cost implications. Plenty of tariffs currently in effect carry exactly that kind of domestic cost, and the administration has sustained them anyway. What makes potash different is the specific combination of near total import dependence, a supplier concentration this extreme, and a domestic political constituency, American farmers, organized enough and electorally significant enough to generate faster, more effective pushback than most other affected industries have managed to produce throughout this same 18-month conflict. It is worth pausing on just how significant that repeated exemption actually is when you place it next to everything else happening inside this same trade conflict. The Section 338 tariffs that did take effect cover roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods, hitting autos, dairy, alcohol, cement, furniture, and hundreds of other product categories with an additional 50% duty. Potash, a commodity where Canada supplies close to 90% of total American import demand, where domestic production covers only a tiny fraction of national need, and where building alternative capacity takes over a decade, was never seriously put at risk of facing that same treatment for any sustained period of time. Every time the administration has tested the waters on a meaningful potash tariff, it has retreated within weeks, sometimes within days, and the retreat has always moved in the same direction, toward lower rates and eventually toward full exemption, never the other way. That pattern tells you something important about how leverage actually functions in a trade relationship this deeply asymmetric, and it cuts directly against the simpler narrative that dominated much of the coverage of this broader conflict, that Canada, sending roughly 3/4 of its exports south of the border, has essentially no leverage of its own and must eventually accept whatever terms Washington sets. Potash demonstrates the opposite dynamic operating in a very specific, very concentrated part of this relationship. Canada does not need to threaten to withhold potash exports to generate leverage over this particular commodity. The simple, structural fact of American dependence generates that leverage automatically, whether or not any Canadian official ever raises the subject explicitly in a negotiation. Washington built the exemption in unprompted every single time because the domestic political cost of touching it seriously was always higher than whatever gain it might have produced in the broader negotiation. Consider what a serious, sustained tariff on Canadian potash would actually have done to American agriculture if the administration had ever followed through on one of its early threats, rather than retreating within days of first floating the idea publicly. Independent agricultural economists have consistently pointed out that potash from Saskatchewan's grade of reserves has no comparably priced, comparably scaled replacement available on any timeline shorter than a decade. A sustained disruption to that supply, even a partial one, would have driven fertilizer prices sharply higher, heading into a planting season, compressing already thin farm profit margins across corn, wheat, soybean, and cotton operations, covering tens of millions of acres of American farmland. Those higher input costs would not have stayed contained to the farm gate. They would have traveled directly through the food supply chain to grocery store shelves, adding to food price inflation at a politically sensitive moment when American consumers were already voicing real frustration about the cost of groceries. A White House that has consistently, repeatedly prioritized protecting farmers and reducing consumer costs in its public messaging was never going to be the administration that let that specific chain of consequences actually play out. And the fact that it kept testing the boundary anyway, 3 separate times, suggests the appeal of using potash as leverage against Canada remained genuinely tempting, even as the political reality kept forcing a retreat. There's also a broader lesson embedded in this specific pattern about how trade negotiations involving deeply integrated commodities tend to actually unfold in practice over months and years, as opposed to how they get described in more simplified political rhetoric delivered from a podium in a single afternoon. Throughout this entire 18-month conflict, both governments have repeatedly framed their positions in maximalist confrontational language, Washington describing Canada as a country that needs America far more than America needs it, Ottawa describing Washington's commitments as increasingly unreliable and describing its own economic future as needing to diversify away from American dependence. Both of those framings contain real truth about different parts of this relationship. But potash sits as a specific, concrete counterexample to the version of this story where Washington simply holds all the cards. In this one commodity, the leverage runs unmistakably in Canada's direction, and Washington's own repeated behavior, 3 retreats in 18 months, each one moving toward greater protection for Canadian potash rather than less, is the clearest possible evidence of that leverage actually functioning in practice, whether or not either government ever describes it in those explicit terms publicly. It is also worth understanding why this particular commodity generates such a fast, disproportionate political response compared to other categories of Canadian imports that have faced sustained, serious tariffs throughout this same conflict, without triggering anything close to this kind of rapid reversal. Autos, dairy, and alcohol each have organized industry advocates in Washington, but none of them touch quite as directly, or quite as immediately, on the single input cost that determines whether a farm operation turns a profit or a loss in a given growing season. Farm groups like the American Farm Bureau Federation carry outsized political weight, specifically because farm states remain electorally significant, and because food price inflation translates almost immediately into a consumer-facing political problem that shows up in grocery bills within a single growing season, not years down the road the way some other supply chain disruptions might take to fully materialize. The combination of concentrated agricultural political power and fast, visible consumer impact is precisely why potash has triggered a faster, more consistent retreat than almost any other category caught inside this broader trade war, even as the administration has stayed genuinely aggressive across nearly every other front of this same conflict. Step back and look at what this 3-time pattern tells you about the broader trajectory of this trade relationship heading into its current, most volatile phase yet, one that has already produced real, active tariffs on both sides of the border this very week. As of this weekend, negotiations between Ottawa and Washington have collapsed entirely. 50% tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods are now in effect, and Canada has announced its own dollar-for-dollar retaliation set to begin September 8th, targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. Even inside that dramatically escalated conflict, potash remains untouched, sitting exactly where it has sat through every previous round of this fight, fully exempted, protected not by any specific clause. Canadian negotiators fought hard to win at the table, but by the same structural American dependence that has forced this exact same retreat 3 separate times already. That consistency, even amid the most serious breakdown this relationship has experienced in 18 months, tells you potash is not a bargaining chip. Either side is currently treating as available for trade. It is simply off the table, by mutual, unstated agreement, because touching it seriously carries consequences neither government appears willing to risk, regardless of how far the rest of this conflict escalates. There is a genuine irony sitting underneath all of this that deserves to be named directly, because it captures something important about the limits of even the most aggressive trade policy when it runs up against deep structural interdependence that no amount of political will can simply override or negotiate away through sheer force of rhetoric alone. An administration that has been willing to reach back 96 years into a nearly forgotten Depression-era statute, specifically to bypass the procedural constraints of more conventional trade law, willing to override an existing free trade agreement it personally negotiated and signed, willing to absorb genuine economic pain across dozens of other product categories in pursuit of leverage over Canada, has never once been willing to sustain a serious tariff on the single commodity where American vulnerability runs deepest and most immediate. That is not a coincidence, and it is not simply a matter of Washington choosing to be generous or strategic on this one specific issue while playing hardball everywhere else. It is what happens when genuine structural economic dependence meets political reality 3 separate times in 3 separate contexts and produces the exact same outcome every single time. What this pattern ultimately suggests, heading into whatever comes next in this now sharply escalated conflict between 2 of the most historically integrated economies on the planet, is that not every category of Canadian export carries the same weight in this relationship, no matter how aggressively either government frames its overall negotiating posture in public statements. Autos, dairy, and alcohol have proven willing to absorb real, sustained tariff pressure across multiple rounds of this 18-month fight. Potash has not once, not for more than a few weeks at a time, regardless of which legal authority the administration reached for or how confrontational the broader relationship became around it. That distinction matters for understanding where the genuine limits of American leverage actually sit in this relationship. And it matters for understanding exactly which parts of Canada's economy carry real demonstrated structural power, the kind that does not require public threats or formal negotiating positions to function, because the underlying dependence itself has already done all the necessary work, 3 times over, in full public view. There's one more angle worth considering before wrapping up, because it speaks to how this specific pattern is likely to hold up or potentially break down as this broader trade conflict continues escalating in the wake of this weekend's collapsed negotiations and Canada's own confirmed September 8th retaliation. Nothing about the current, more adversarial phase of this relationship has touched potash so far, and there is good structural reason to expect that trend to continue, even if tensions between Ottawa and Washington keep intensifying. Canada's own retaliatory tariffs, targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics, notably do not include any American commodity with a comparably extreme dependence structure running in the reverse direction. Because no equivalent commodity really exists in this relationship, that asymmetry itself is revealing, Canada has genuine structural leverage over specific American vulnerabilities, potash chief among them, in a way the United States simply does not have an equivalent lever to pull back with in the other direction. At least not one this concentrated, this immediate, or this politically explosive if actually deployed. There's also a currency and markets angle worth considering briefly here, because fertilizer commodity traders watch potash-specific policy signals extremely closely given how concentrated global supply actually is among just a handful of major producers. Any credible signal that Washington might sustain a serious tariff on Canadian potash tends to move prices for potash futures and to related agricultural input contracts almost immediately, well before any tariff actually takes effect, simply because traders understand how limited the realistic substitution options are on any timeline that matters to next season's planting decisions. That immediate market reaction, in turn, feeds back into the political pressure calculation inside Washington, because rising fertilizer futures prices translate quickly into farm groups raising alarms even before a single shipment has actually crossed the border under a new higher rate. This feedback loop, tariff signal, market reaction, farm group pressure, policy reversal, has now played out in a remarkably similar way across all 3 of these retreats, suggesting it functions less like a series of isolated coincidences and more like a fairly predictable, repeatable mechanism built into how this specific commodity interacts with American domestic politics whenever it gets pulled into the broader trade conflict. If this breakdown helped you understand why potash keeps escaping every single round of this trade war, while almost everything else gets caught in it, hit subscribe so you do not miss how the rest of this conflict unfolds now that talks have collapsed and retaliation is locked in for September 8th. And drop a comment telling us whether you think this pattern holds even if this trade war keeps escalating further, or whether potash eventually becomes fair game too once every other form of leverage has already been exhausted.